Okay, everybody, thank you so much. My name is Buvia Yulin, and I'm the director for SCMA. Welcome to Resolving Conflict Strategies and Techniques for Everyone at Work and Home with Ken Cloke. This event is in webinar format, which means you can see and hear us, but we cannot hear and see you. This virtual event is also being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. If you have any general questions regarding this event, please feel free to send me or Taisha Preston a chat, or you can email us at info@scmediation.org. I will now turn over to our California Mediation Awareness Week Chair, Outreach Committee Chair, and one of today's sponsors, Marlon Shulman.
Good morning, and thank you, Bouvier, for that lovely introduction. It was certainly a team effort to put this week's presentation on. Thank you all for joining us in recognition of California Mediation Awareness Week. The Southern California Mediation Association, otherwise known as the SCMA, is pleased to present this week's programs. The SCMA's aim for the week is to promote mediation, engage with professionals, promote it to the wider community, of course, and encourage as many people to use this form of dispute resolution as well as talk about it. If you're not familiar with the SCMA, I'd like to take a minute to introduce you to the organization. Whether you're a mediator or not, it's a fascinating group of people with great representations, and we welcome anyone to join us. We are the largest professional association of mediators in the state of California. Our mission is to nurture, expand, and develop the practice, profession, and community of mediation. We do this in a number of ways. We offer 2 major educational conferences per year, even besides this one. FMI, or the Family Mediation Institute, which will take place May 20 to the 22nd in the desert, will be a great destination conference with great presentations and workshops. We also host our annual conference every November. Both conferences draw top-notch thought leaders in the field and are excellent networking and educational events. We offer a number of ongoing online programs throughout the year, such as this one, and other trainings and workshops. We have PDGs, or professional development groups, where our members network, share ideas, get feedback, learn, and they learn about different situations and circumstances. We also offer a number of social events during the year for networking. Most importantly, SCMA is a supportive group of positive individuals from a variety of educational and professional backgrounds, committed to mediation and conflict resolution. Whether you're a mediator or not, if you'd like to learn more about the SCMA, please visit us at scmediation.org. That's scmediation.org. I think now we're going to, well, let me read you about one of the sponsors. I'm very pleased to be one of the sponsors of this particular webinar, but our other major sponsor is Online Dispute Resolution International, otherwise known as ODRI, O-D-R-I. ODRI is a marketplace platform for online dispute resolution that was born out of the recognition that people should have multiple accessible pathways of initiating and resolving their disputes. ODRI focuses on bridging the gap between individuals experiencing disputes and professionals who could help resolve the dispute, such as mediators. The platform is designed to support numerous users, allowing them to conduct the entire negotiation or mediation process online. Parties experiencing disputes can negotiate with each other or can request the assistance of a mediator listed on the ODRI platform. ODRI helps parties to resolve their disputes faster, safely, and cost-effectively. There's their motto, click to resolve. I think we have a short video right now. Thanks for that video, Bouvier. I wanted, before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to remind people that questions can be posted on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will be reading them as appropriate and as time permits. Now, I get to introduce just a fantastic man who is an icon in the industry. Kenneth Cloke is a nationally recognized and celebrated mediator, arbitrator, coach, consultant, and trainer, specializing in resolving complex multi-party disputes, including transnational, marital, divorce, family, grievance, and workplace disputes, organizational, public policy, and school conflicts, and as well as designing preventive conflict resolution systems. He has worked in over 25 countries and is the founder and first president of Mediators Beyond Borders. He is the director and founder of the Center for Dispute Resolution in Santa Monica. His university teaching includes law, mediation, history, and other social sciences at a number of colleges and universities, including Southwestern University School of Law, Southern Methodist University, Pepperdine University School of Law, Antioch University, Occidental College, USC, and UCLA. He's the published author of numerous seminal books and journal articles on conflict resolution, including one that has deeply affected my own life and those I'm sure of others, Mediating Dangerously. He is an absolute pleasure to talk and work with, and it is my deep honor to introduce Ken Cloke. Ken?
Thank you very much. What a kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak to the group that is here today. Thank you also to Bouvier and to Taisha for your support, and to SCMA, of course, for all the work that you have done over decades to promote conflict resolution locally and support conflict resolvers around the world. I think in beginning our conversation today, it's important to acknowledge that it is taking place right now in a period of war. People are dying in Ukraine as a result of a conflict that has taken place in which several attempts have been made to mediate that dispute, but those attempts have not yet succeeded. So I think we need to stop for a moment and recognize first the incredible importance of conflict resolution, for the lack of which people are dying virtually every day. And secondly, I think we need to acknowledge that we are not yet skilled enough in how we resolve conflicts. There is an enormous amount to learn. I have been practicing this now pretty much full time for over 42 years. And I have yet to feel that I know everything about it, or even have gotten to a point where I feel that I understand at a deep level everything that's taking place in conflict and everything that is possible in resolution. But what I'd like to do today is to offer a few ideas for those of you who are mediators and those who are not, for those who are in conflict and those who are not perhaps at the moment, but maybe at some point in the future. So to begin with, just to take a moment to recognize the people who are suffering right now in Ukraine and in the US and around the world as a result of conflicts that they have experienced, and to rededicate ourselves to assisting those people in finding ways of resolving their conflicts. So there's a wonderful passage that is in that was written many years ago by one of the founders of conflict resolution, and her name is Mary Parker Follett. She wrote in the 1910s and 1920s, and here's what she wrote. We have thought of peace as passive and war as the active way of living. The opposite is true. War is not the most strenuous life. It is a kind of rest cure compared to the task of reconciling our differences. From war to peace is not from the strenuous to the easy existence. It is from the futile to the effective, from the stagnant to the active, from the destructive to the creative way of life. The world will be regenerated by the people who rise above these passive ways and heroically seek, by whatever hardship, by whatever toil, the methods by which people can agree. And I think this sentiment applies not only to war, but to the smaller wars that take place between us. The little wars that take place in families, between siblings, between kids and parents, the wars that take place in the workplace, between coworkers, between staff and supervisors, or managers, or whoever it may happen to be. So here's a kind of first idea that I would like to have us think together about. And that is, rather than focus on one conflict and the specific characteristics of that particular conflict, what we also need to do, in addition to understanding that conflict, is to understand the nature of conflict in general, and then to extrapolate from our understanding of conflict in general back to the specific conflict that we are facing, and from the specific conflict to add to our understanding of the nature of conflict in general. So here's a kind of basic question for mediators. What is it that determines the nature of mediation? And I believe that the answer is the nature of conflict. So here's an initial question for all of you who are listening now. And it's a question you can ask yourself or you can ask others. If I could see you now, I would ask you to raise your hand if you grew up in a family in which there was zero conflict. If you grew up in a neighborhood where there was no conflict whatsoever. If you had no conflicts at school, if you experienced no conflicts in your relationships, your romantic relationships with others, no conflicts in the workplace. And I think very clearly the answer will occur to you that everyone experiences conflicts from cradle to grave. And the second question I would ask is to raise your hand if in the course of your family life, at any point between kindergarten and 12th grade, before you were hired on your first job or your current job, did you take a course in conflict resolution? And I think that the answer will be no. Generally speaking, here's the picture. Every one of us is immersed in conflicts throughout our lives, and none of us are prepared to handle it. So what mediation fundamentally is the study of conflict and the identification of possible ways of solving it. And when I say possible, here's what I mean. No two human beings are the same. No single human being is the same from one moment to the next. And therefore, no two conflicts are the same. and no conflict is the same from one moment to the next. Therefore, how does the mediator know what to do? And the answer is we don't. None of us do. No matter how many years you've spent doing this work, if you think that you have the answer to someone's conflict, you've just lost all possibility of doing anything fundamental to resolve it. So here's what we need to do. We need to, number one, listen to each other. Well, it turns out that listening is a fundamental a fundamental skill in every conflict. And so part of what it takes to become a mediator is to learn the skill of listening. But we can all be mediators in our own conflicts to some extent. And what this means is that we have to actually turn to the person that we don't trust, don't like, disagree with, the one who has just insulted us, the one who is bullying or threatening us, and figure out a question that we could ask that person that would allow us to listen to not just to what is taking place on the surface, because most of that actually is provocative and destructive, but instead to listen to where that came from, to listen to what is beneath the surface of the conflict, to listen for its underlying reasons, listen for the deeper emotions, the feelings of pain, the caring, the needs and desires and interests that underlie people's conflict conversations. So the very first step in resolving any conflict is to bring together the people who can't talk to one another and help them have a conversation that can help. Well, if you bring together two people who can't talk to each other without any assistance, without any guidance, they're just going to get into the same argument they've been having up until now. And that is going to go precisely nowhere. So one of the definitions that we can offer, one of the characteristics of conflict, is that it is a state of being stuck. People in conflict are stuck. They're stuck in their relationships. They're stuck in their communications. They're stuck in their attitudes towards one another. They're stuck in their processes. They're even stuck in many ways in their cultures, in the structures that are available to them, the systems that determine how they interact with each other. And so what conflict resolution consists of at a simple level is becoming unstuck. And how do we get unstuck? Well, fundamentally, what we have to do is to ask a question that helps people see beneath the surface of their conflict, because at least 90 to 95%, and sometimes up to 100% of a conflict is taking place beneath the surface. So what kinds of questions are these? Let me give you three categories of questions that I could ask everyone on this call. Category one: who is the oldest person on this call? Who is the youngest? Who's the tallest? Who's the shortest? Who lives the closest to the Pacific Ocean? Who lives the farthest away? Notice there is a single correct answer for everyone. Category two: how old are you? How tall are you? Where do you live? And now notice there's a single correct answer for each person. Category three: what issues are you facing at whatever age you're at? What does your height mean to you? What do you love about where you live? What do you not love about where you live? And now notice we have created multiple correct answers for everyone. So here's another definition of conflict. It is the assumption that there is a single correct answer to a question that in fact has multiple correct answers. But if there's a single correct answer for everyone, one answer has to be the most correct. And therefore what we have is a power struggle, a contest of wills, battle to see who's going to win and who's going to lose. And we call this a zero-sum game. And zero-sum means out of 10, if you get 6, I get 4. If you get 7, I get 3. But there is also a possibility of creating a non-zero-sum game, what is sometimes called a win-win process. And in a win-win process, what happens is there can be more than one correct answer, more than one truth, more than one person who has been hurt by what happened, more than one person who needs to be listened to or acknowledged. And therefore, what we want to do is to try initially to discover what those deeper elements are that are taking place in the conflict. Oops, sorry about that. Hold on one second. Carol Bloom in the question and answer section asked the question, why listen to, why do you tie listening to asking questions? What about refraining from asking questions, but honing our skills as mediators or as people in conflict at reflecting what we're hearing? Excellent question, Carol. And let's go back here to the beginning and now try to expand what we've said. We talked initially about bringing people together into the same conversation, then about asking them questions in order to discover what is taking place for them. And then what we want to do, as Carol suggests, is to stop asking questions and actually listen deeply to what it is that they're saying. And then what we may want to do is to reflect, as Carol suggests, on what it is that we've heard. We may then come up with additional questions. We may instead come up with some understanding of a deeper emotional experience that each person is having that needs to be recognized, acknowledged, and processed in order for them to be able to move on to problem solving. So we can now say that we've got several stages in every mediation. Stage 1 we can call setting the stage. That is, designing the kind of conversation that we want to have. And what Carol's question brings us to is an important recognition that beneath the stories that people tell are a set of underlying emotions and interests. Emotions we understand fairly well. We experience them all the time, but we need to have a deeper understanding of what's going on there. But before we get there, I'd like to say something about interests. So interest is a word of art among mediators, and that word of art fundamentally distinguishes positions, which are what we want, from interests, which are the reasons why we want it. And we can argue forever about positions, but interests have multiple correct answers, or rather, if we put it slightly differently, multiple ways of being satisfied. So that means there doesn't have to be a winner and a loser. Here is my favorite example. If we assume right now that all of us in a non-COVID face-to-face, person-to-person world, we're in the same room. Now let's assume that there's an air conditioning unit that is working in the room. And if we divide the room in half, let's say that half the room wants the air conditioning unit on and the other half wants it off. What's the answer? Well, the air conditioning unit is either on or off. So somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And now let's assume that everybody who wants the air conditioning unit on is male, and everybody who wants it off is female. Everybody who wants it on is white. Everybody who wants it off is African American, Latino, Latinx, Asian, whatever. Or however we want to divide it. Everybody who wants it on is in Ukraine, and everybody who wants it off is in Russia. What's the answer? War, on whatever scale we intend to fight it. But now notice there is an alternative way of doing this. We call this first problem the problem of power. And what we have discovered are power-oriented solutions to the problem. So power, war, we can even put it more dramatically, war is a form of conflict resolution. But it is a form of conflict resolution that relies on a zero-sum outcome. That is, that seeks to defeat and destroy the enemy. So what's the alternative? Well, after an enormous amount of suffering and loss, what often happens is that people negotiate an outcome. How do we negotiate the air conditioner? Well, let's say that, let's have a vote. All in favor of the air conditioning unit being on? Well, if we go by majority rule, the air conditioning unit again is on or it's off. But if we move a little bit further than that and create a set of minority rights in addition to majority rule, then what we will do is maybe we will have the air conditioning unit on for 2 hours and off for 1 hour. This is a typical collective bargaining agreement, a typical negotiation. We call this a rights-based process, and it fundamentally underlies all legal processes. The third option, because the difficulty with both power and rights is that there are winners and losers. Somebody suffers as a result. Somebody's unhappy. Somebody doesn't get their needs met. So mediation is what we call an interest-based approach to problem solving. And what do we do in mediation? We ask the participants a question. Why do you want the air conditioning unit on? Answer, it's stuffy in here. Well, how about if we open some windows? How about if we take a break? How about if we bring in a fan? Well, I want it off because I can't hear. Well, how about if the speaker uses a microphone? How about if you move closer to the speaker? Well, I want the air conditioning off because I'm freezing. Well, how about if people who don't want it off, give the people who do, people who want it off, give the people who don't their jackets, or we bring in a space heater. In other words, multiple options for resolution open up that do not require a winner or a loser. This is fundamentally what mediation is. It's a search, a collaborative search for answers that satisfy interests. That is, not what you want, but the reasons why you want it. Now, let's go back for a moment to the problem of emotion. So here is a fundamental idea. Everybody in every conflict is experiencing it emotionally. And the difficulty with emotion is that not that emotions are irrational, but they follow a different kind of rationality. But what ordinarily happens if somebody in the workplace or at home becomes intensely emotional about something? Well, the first response often is to either deny or suppress that emotion. Why? Because we do not have the skills we need in order to handle it without getting triggered ourselves. So we now have a new definition of conflict. Conflict is a lack of skill in being able to handle someone else's behavior. But if we were more skillful, we would handle that problem differently. And in ways that don't require winners and losers. So the difficulty is that politics as a process, as a kind of conversation, as a form of problem solving, has three fundamental characteristics. It can be power-based, as it is in Ukraine and Russia right now. It can be rights-based, as it is in every court case, or it can be interest-based, as it is in mediation, in teamwork, in the development of close collaborative relationships, for example, in couples and in families. So the point of this is, when we take a look at how to resolve conflicts at work and how to resolve them in the home, we can see that many of the answers are going to be the same. And here's what those answers fundamentally are with regard to emotion. What do you do with respect to intense emotion? And in the first place, what we have to do is not suppress it or deny it or push it away or pretend it doesn't exist, because none of those things work. If you were experiencing an intense emotion and someone does one of those things to you, how does it feel? What's your response? And the answer is, it doesn't feel very good. It doesn't feel like you've been heard or acknowledged. And that's fundamentally what you are looking for. You want the other person to listen, not just to the facts, but to the meaning of the facts. And more importantly, even than that, the meaning of the facts to you. That is, to listen to you. And so what emotional listening is it is listening deeply to the human being who is in front of us. Listening not just to what happened to them, but how it felt. And people will tell you stories about their conflicts. And the fundamental determinant in every conflict story is what it felt like to me. And therefore, every conflict story is a kind of indicator of who you are, what's important to you, what matters, what is happening in your life, and how somebody else like me might be able to make a difference for you in this conversation that we're having right now. So now if we go back to politics, are there emotions in politics? Of course there are. And we can now say that in addition to resolving conflicts at home and at work, we can also use conflict resolution principles to reduce the levels of political conflict by recognizing the validity, not of the specific things that people are saying that we may in fact disagree with, but of the underlying essence of what they are trying to communicate, which is what this means to me. And in attempting to understand that, what we discover is that emotions are a pathway to interests, and that interests are a pathway to resolution. So how do interests create a pathway to resolution? The answer is they help us identify ways of thinking about problems that allow us to solve them collaboratively and relatively easily. And I say relatively because not every problem is simple to solve. And political problems are among the most difficult. But if we have something that is important to us, if there is an interest that we have that has not been recognized, we're going to get upset. And if we are upset and no one has acknowledged the fact that we are upset, we're going to get more upset. And so if we take a look just politically at the problem, any number of problems that exist in the US, if we take the problem of racism as an illustration, or any of the other political problems that people have been having arguments over for decades, is there a feeling on the part of people in that argument that they have not been heard? Absolutely. That their interests have not been met? Of course. Has that produced resentment? Yes, absolutely. And has that resentment made it difficult for us to solve the problem? Yes. And at the same time, it is an indicator of a pathway to resolution. So the mediation pathway to resolution is to say, how awful for you to feel that way. Tell me more. And to be able to elicit emotion, to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it not just in a kind of dismissive or minimizing way, but even if you're going to do this, to make it more powerful, stronger than what the person initially said to you. When you do that, the person feels heard, and they are now ready to move on to say, here's what I need in order to solve my problem. Now, this doesn't happen always or everywhere, but it happens often enough to be an important tool for mediators in figuring out how to resolve their conflicts. And then what do? We transition into problem solving. But here's the difficulty. If we haven't listened first, we're going to end up solving the wrong problem. Here's a second difficulty. What if the problem is a paradox? What if the problem has more than one correct solution, and we've picked one of them and dismissed the other correct solution as irrelevant, as unnecessary? And here what we will see is that fundamentally what we have done is we've lost an opportunity to solve the problem at a deep level. So over decades, even over clearly more than a century and a half, we have really many centuries, we have dismissed the problem of race, not listened, not tried to solve it, not acknowledged the emotions that people have experienced who are been for whom this is a fact of life, and missed many opportunities from problem solving. Has that happened in Ukraine and Russia? Absolutely. So maybe a decade and a half ago, I worked in Ukraine and Russia, and I facilitated dialogues between Ukrainians and Russians. And I can tell you that even maybe 20 years ago, whenever this occurred, there were not only deep underlying emotional issues, deep underlying unsatisfied interests, but a number of prejudices and biases and stereotypes and discriminations that each side felt from the other. And in the course of those dialogues, what was discovered is that it is possible, what I discovered, and I've done them not only between Ukrainians and Russians, but Nicaraguans and Sandinistas, between Greek citizens and immigrants, Israelis and Palestinians. I've done many of these types of dialogues. And a large dialogue like that is a large scale case of a small scale dialogue that can take place in every conflict. So what we are looking for in conflict resolution is not just listening and not just asking questions and not just reflecting, or as we call it, reframing what it is that people say. Not only listening to the emotions, not only trying to discover the underlying interests, but also seeking to invite people into a problem-solving conversation that is grounded in their capacity for empathy and willingness to hear what is important to the other side. So fundamentally, we can now see that there are at least 5 steps in every mediation process: setting the stage, listening to the stories, acknowledging the emotions, surfacing the interests, solving the problems. What happens if that doesn't work? Well, we move on to the next set of skills, which are in how to negotiate the differences between people. And one part of every mediation is a kind of negotiation. Okay, that's what you want. I can hear that. Here's what I want. Now what? Well, it may be possible to solve that problem easily, but if it isn't, now what? The answer to the now what is that we try to create a process of collaborative negotiation. That is, negotiation in which each side sees that it's important for the other side to get what's important to them. A negotiation in which there is cooperation in identifying potential solutions, investigating to find out whether they might work, trying them out as pilot projects and seeing if they work. And here the basic guide for what we do comes initially from Roger Fisher and William Ury in their classic book, Getting to Yes. And if you haven't read that book, it's a very useful one and one that I would recommend to you. So even if we can't solve the problem, and even worse, if we can't negotiate agreements with one another, what do? Well, then what happens is we try to negotiate our disagreements, that is, agree to disagree. So for example, can we agree that neither of us is going to use violence in trying to solve this problem? Agreed? Great. Agreement 1. Can we agree that neither of us is going to insult each other personally or do our best not to do that? Great. Agreement number 2. And now notice we are creating a kind of perimeter around the conflict that will help people feel less out of control and become less emotionally reactive and therefore more willing to engage in destructive behaviors like war and violence. And there isn't time, of course, in this discussion to identify all the things that we might be able to do. But here's the point of this, and I think it's important to emphasize our collective success in this. 100% of the people who come to see a mediator are completely stuck. They have no idea what to do. And depending on the nature of the dispute, somewhere between 80 and 98% of those people who are 100% stuck will become unstuck and will reach agreements that help to satisfy their interests, or agreements they're willing to live by. How do we do this? There's no judge telling you what to do. There's no dictator who gives orders and says, okay, here's the way it's going to be. Instead, we have a third process, and the process is consensus building. Meaning everybody has a veto power. Everybody has the ability to say no. So once you have chosen to say yes, here's another statistic. Somewhere between 98 and 99% of the people who reach those agreements have no problems enforcing their agreements, in spite of the fact that there's no cop or judge or dictator telling them they have to, or parent or boss telling them they have to do this. Why? Because they chose it voluntarily. They had a right not to. They thought about it. They listened. They spoke. They felt heard. And now they're prepared to try to put an end to this conflict. So having said this, there's a last point that I want to make before opening it up for more comments and questions and responses, disagreements, whatever. And that is this: conflict is an immense creative force. Conflict is, in my definition, the sound made by the cracks in a system. It is the voice of a new paradigm waiting to be born. It is our own lack of skill, and therefore an opportunity for learning how to get better at handling problems that we couldn't handle before. So as mediators, we are not opposed to conflict. We are opposed to the assumption that only destructive outcomes are possible. And we are the agents of the creation of positive, constructive outcomes. Not the only agents. We facilitate those conversations, but it is not our decision. The decision always rests with the people who have the conflict. So, what do you do in your next conflict? Try to figure out what's actually going on. And if you just do one thing, I would say get curious about not just what's taking place below the surface, but about who this other person is. And here's a question I would suggest you ask yourself with regard to your opponent, your enemy, your adversary. Here's your question to yourself. What would have had to have happened to me in order to make me act like that? And search for the answer. So the most important thing is to begin. And in this sense, every mediator, no matter how experienced you are, and I've done tens of thousands of mediations, the first step is always one where we're a beginner. So there are no experts here. There are just people who are more or less willing to take the risk of beginning. And that's what fundamentally defines a mediator. So I'm hoping this is helpful to you. And I would now like to open it up for any questions. You're welcome to put those in the Q&A section, or
We have a few questions.
Great.
Do you want to read them, or I can sign off and you can read them?
Well, let's see. Here's Anthony Faringa. Hello, Anthony. What are some strategies to create balance when there is a power imbalance between the parties? Really good question. So there are, unfortunately, I can talk for a whole other hour just about this one. So I'd like to just give a couple of fundamental ideas. One, instead of it being, Dr. Smith, how do you feel about what Helen just said? It is Fred and Helen. And between the two of them, we're probably going to ask Helen to go first instead of Fred. Maybe yes, maybe not. But these are some small things that we could do at the level of process to try to create a balance. In addition, there is an automatic balance in mediation because of consensus. That is, everybody has a veto power. But in addition to this, what we want to do is to shift the dynamic from power and rights to interests. And when you ask a question like, what issues are you facing at whatever age you are at? Nobody has the right answer, and power is now meaningless. So we have bypassed the problem of power balancing. In most mediations, it's something that mediators have to pay attention to. Again, I could talk for quite some length about this, but I think we need to skip on to some other questions. Thank you for your question, Anthony. Lee Blackman. What are the most important skills for addressing emotion, accepting emotional states, and using them positively, or at least directing them so they do not poison the effort to resolve the dispute? Excellent question, Lee. So here are a couple of things. Number one, give permission to people to express their emotions. Number two, normalize having emotion. Number three, acknowledge the emotion. And if you're going to reframe the emotion, that is, if you're going to use some different words, for example, if I say, what you just said was upset me, if as the mediator I say, well, it sounds like you were mildly irritated by what she just said, you're going to get more upset and say, no, I was upset. I wasn't mildly irritated. But if you say, it sounds like you were really angry, the person will say, no, I was just upset. And they'll start to calm down. So if you're going to reframe to a higher emotion, a more intense emotion than a less intense one. And I think that as Lee says, accepting those emotional states and then turning the emotion in the direction of problem solving. So people who have experienced strokes in the emotional processing centers of their brains are unable to do one critical and essential thing. They can no longer make decisions about anything, because when you decide what you're going to wear in the morning, what you're going to put on as clothes, you pick the clothes you like. Like is an emotional process, a small one, but a real one. And so emotions are a source of information about the problem as a whole, that is a gestalt, if you will, using psychological terminology. And emotions give you information about what is happening because we are vibrating in sync with each other. And we can then use that emotion as a way of trying to figure out, now, how do we act on that emotion in order to be able to move it towards problem solving? And I think that the answer is you have to complete the emotion, but you don't complete anger with more anger. The completion of anger is the expression of caring, because nobody gets angry over things they don't care about. So those are some small examples. Again, we could talk for another hour about that. Donald O'Sullivan, when people ask me what do I do, I'm fond of saying that when I'm not busy creating conflict in my own life, I help people solve their conflicts. Quote, if we haven't listened properly, we end up solving them. Yeah. Examples. Boy, I've got tons of examples where I have assumed that the problem was one thing, and it turned out it was something completely different. Somebody, for example, an employee in a workplace who was complaining because he was mistreated, because he'd been passed over for promotion. Turned out he was incredibly angry not only over being passed over for for promotion, but because of events in his personal life that were carrying over to work. So that's an example of the failure on my part, until I heard this, to realize that there were another set of questions I needed to ask. Like, where do you think this emotion comes from? Have you experienced it any other time in your life or any other place, etc.? So the 5 stages Christina asks, there are actually 8 that I like to do. Number 1, setting the stage. 2, listening to the stories. 3, acknowledging the emotions. 4, surfacing the interests. 5, solving the problem, if we can do that. 6, negotiating the differences. 7, which I didn't mention, is confirming the commitments, what it is people are really going to do differently. Okay, now that we've agreed on this, what's going to happen? And finally, closing the process, reaching closure. And Peter from Australia, what core skills would you want politicians, leaders, work managers to possess in our next generation of leaders, politicians? There's a simple answer to this. It is exactly the skills that we are learning and practicing as mediators. I think that it really should be a prerequisite for every politician to be trained in conflict resolution. But we need to go deeper than this and understand, for example, George Lakoff, a professor at Berkeley, has written a very powerful book about political language. Notice that one of the very first things that was done in Russia was to prohibit anyone from using the words war or invasion regarding what was happening in Ukraine. And notice that with regard to race, we are now abolishing conversations about race in the form of what is called critical race theory in schools. And Florida has passed a law that is being referred to by many people as the Don't Say Gay law. And so these are actually remarkably similar, because what they represent is a refusal to listen to the other side. And that is a prescription for conflict. So I think those are the kinds of skills that are needed. Peter, thank you for the question. Carol, thanks for sharing your wisdom. I think it is important to share that what you're describing as mediation is one view approach. Both problem solving and interest-based are not the only ways to view conflict resolution, and mediation. Absolutely, Carol. And let me say, this is just my particular way of doing it. There are literally as many ways of approaching conflicts as there are mediators, and probably more, because I've got lots inside of me as well. This is a shorthand and one that I hope will be helpful to you moving forward. We've now reached the end of our time, I think, Marlon.
Yes, unless you want to ask her, I think there's 1 or 2 other questions. If it's okay with you.
Sure. Okay, so let's see. Anonymous attendee, do you have suggestions for sibling conflicts? Absolutely. Sibling conflicts are among the very first places that we learn conflict and conflict resolution, and where we experience deep unresolved emotional issues that keep getting triggered. So having mediated a large number, many hundreds of sibling disputes over the course of many decades, I would say that the fundamental thing to do is to bring those siblings into conversation with each other and ask each one of them to describe the way that they see it. But what we need to do is to go much deeper than that and say, for example, what are the stories that each of you tell about each other? What are the narratives that you have created about each other? And are those stereotypes that you have of each other true? For you, does that sound like you? If not, who are you really? What do you want your sibling to know about you? or what's different about you, or what's different today about you. Or here's my favorite beginning. Question 1, what words would you use to describe the kind of relationship you most want to have with each other? And then a variety of follow-ups. What is one thing you could do in order to create that relationship? What is one thing the other person could do? Etc. There are a series of other methods like that. Sonal Ladva, thank you, Richard, for your comment. Sonal Ladva says, what is the role of caucus in problem solving with parties that do not trust each other? A caucus is a way of taking people one step back from the conflict that they are immersed in and being reactive with, and allowing them, in the absence of the other person, to tell you what the real problem is for them. But if they don't trust the other person, and I should tell you that my view of this is that trust is the first casualty in every conflict. So they automatically don't trust each other. Caucus is a way of pulling away from the necessity of creating trust first, and instead first trying to figure out what is the problem that really needs to be solved here. And it's a useful way of doing that. So if there are two kids on a playground who are fighting, the first thing you do is separate them. But the separation won't help them figure out how to talk to each other or negotiate their solutions. And the same is true with caucus. If the only thing that you do is caucus, you're going to be limited in terms of the kind of outcome you can reach, to one that just settles the outstanding issues, just like as if you were going to court. But you will not be able to restructure your relationship with one another. Last word. Mediation is a magical process. And I mean that literally. There is magic in this work. And that magic we can think of as transformational, meaning a change in the form of the conflict, the conversation, the relationship. If you change the form of any of those, you begin to change the shape of the conflict. So I want to say that this is a somewhat simplified view of conflict resolution. As Carol points out, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of variation, including in my own practice. I will do something different even with the same people from one minute to the next. And therefore, what we really need to do in any conflict is show up and be present for the people who are in front of us.
We have gone over time. Ken, thank you so much, number one, of course, for the presentation itself, but for finishing up some questions that were outstanding. I'm going to turn it over to Bouvier to talk about tomorrow's seminar, but also to thank you as well. Thank you, Ken, very much.
Thank you very much, Marlon.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's always such a pleasure to have you on our programs. We're very grateful for you and Joan for always taking the time to be with SCMA. We really appreciate it. Tomorrow, we will continue our California Mediation Awareness Week at 12 noon tomorrow, Divorce Without Court. We have an excellent panel. So the registration information is on our website. For this recording, it will be up on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. So go ahead and follow us on YouTube. You can find us at Southern California Mediation Association. Again, thank you everybody so much for being here, for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
And thank you, Bouvier, and all of the people in SCMA for doing what you're doing and helping to make this work spread outwards into the world where we desperately need it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.